Picture this. You're sitting at your grandmother's mahogany dining table, surrounded by 3 generations of family, when your own brother slams your face against the antique china cabinet and clicks handcuffs around your wrists. The charge? Impersonating a federal judge and fraud. The irony? You're actually one of the 9 most powerful people in the American legal system. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Justice Elena Whitmore, and what happened that Thanksgiving evening in Millfield changed everything. Not just for me, but for a family that had spent 15 years believing they knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. Have you ever been so successful that your own family couldn't comprehend it? Have you ever achieved something so extraordinary that the people who raised you assumed it had to be fake? This is the story of how a family dinner became a federal incident, how a brother's jealousy became a career-ending mistake, and how sometimes the people who think they know you best are actually the ones who know you least. My childhood in Millfield, Connecticut, was built on a foundation of expectations that felt as solid and unchanging as the Georgian colonial house where 4 generations of Whitmores had learned what it meant to be respectable, predictable, and safely ordinary. The house itself was a monument to conventional success. White columns, black shutters, perfectly manicured lawn that my father, Henry Whitmore III, maintained with the same meticulous attention he brought to his accounting practice downtown. Inside those walls, success had a very specific definition. My brother Marcus, 18 months older and infinitely more suited to our parents' vision of achievement, embodied everything the Whitmore name represented. Star quarterback at Millfield High, homecoming king, full scholarship to University of Connecticut for criminal justice. He was the golden child who made our parents beam with pride at neighborhood barbecues and PTA meetings. My son, the future police officer, Dad would announce to anyone within earshot, his chest swelling with the kind of pride reserved for dreams fulfilled exactly as planned. Marcus would stand there in his Letterman jacket, all broad shoulders and easy confidence, accepting congratulations for a future that seemed as inevitable as sunrise. Me, I was the question mark in our family's need equation. Elena Catherine Whitmore, born stubborn and curious in ways that made our mother, Patricia, nervously adjust her pearl earrings whenever teachers called with reports of my latest intellectual enthusiasm. While Marcus threw perfect spirals on Friday nights under stadium lights, I spent weekends in the town library, devouring Supreme Court case histories with the intensity other kids reserve for video games. Elena's going through a phase, Mom would tell her book club friends when they asked why I preferred constitutional law texts to the romance novels that consumed my female classmates. She'll grow out of it when she meets the right boy and settles down. But I never grew out of it. If anything, I grew deeper into it, developing an understanding of legal precedent and constitutional interpretation that impressed my high school government teacher enough to pull me aside after class one memorable Tuesday afternoon. "Elena," Mrs. Davidson said, her voice carrying the kind of urgency teachers reserve for students they believe might actually change the world. "Have you ever considered law school? Really considered it? Because what you did with that mock trial argument yesterday, that wasn't high school level thinking. That was the kind of legal reasoning I've seen from federal appellate attorneys." The suggestion felt like permission to dream bigger than Millfield's borders, bigger than the safe trajectory my parents had mapped out for their daughter. While Marcus was earning praise for his conventional path toward local law enforcement, I was quietly researching law schools with the same methodical intensity I brought to everything else. Harvard Law School, Yale Law School, Stanford Law School. Names that felt like incantations, like doorways to a world where intellectual curiosity wasn't a phase to outgrow, but a foundation to build upon. I spent my senior year crafting applications that represented everything I'd been thinking about for 4 years, but had never been able to articulate in our family's vocabulary of modest expectations. The day my Harvard Law acceptance letter arrived was the day I learned what real disappointment looked like in our household. Not anger, disappointment. The kind of bone-deep disappointment that said, "We expected better from you," without actually defining what better would have looked like. "Harvard Law School?" Dad said, reading the letter with the same expression he might reserve for a tax audit notice. "Elena, sweetheart, don't you think you're being a little ambitious? Law school is expensive, competitive, difficult. It's not really a field for girls like you. Girls like me." As if he had any idea what girls like me were capable of achieving when given the chance to try. Marcus, home from his sophomore year at UConn, looked up from his criminal justice textbook, some introduction to police procedures course he'd been highlighting with religious dedication. "She's just trying to prove something," he said, without really looking at me. "Remember when she wanted to be an astronaut or a doctor? She'll change her mind before orientation." That stung more than Dad's practical concerns or Mom's worried fussing about the social implications of having a lawyer daughter. It stung because it revealed how little my own brother understood about who I was becoming, how completely he had missed the consistency in what everyone else saw as random phases. Every dream I'd announced since middle school had been building toward this moment. The astronaut phase had been about understanding complex systems and making decisions under pressure. The doctor phase had been about analyzing evidence and reaching life-changing conclusions. Everything had been preparation for a career in law, but they'd been too focused on the surface changes to see the underlying pattern.
Mom tried a different approach, settling beside me on the living room sofa with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "Darling, law school is wonderful in theory, but have you thought about the practical aspects? The long hours, the stress, the competition with men who won't always treat you fairly? You could teach elementary school, work part-time, have a family of your own someday." Teaching elementary school, part-time work, a family of my own someday. All perfectly respectable goals that felt like cages when I imagined applying them to my life. But what they couldn't see, what none of them could understand, was that I wasn't running toward law school because I had no other options. I was running toward it because it was the only option that felt like home. That summer before leaving for Cambridge became an extended exercise in translation, trying to explain dreams in a language my family couldn't hear. Every conversation felt like speaking fluent future, while they spoke fluent past, with no common ground in the present where we could meet and understand each other. "Elena's very smart," Mom would tell her friends, the phrase carrying undertones of apology, as if intelligence were a condition to be managed rather than a gift to be celebrated. "We just hope she finds her way to something more suitable eventually." Something more suitable. Something smaller. Something that fit within their understanding of what Whitmore daughters were supposed to accomplish. So I stopped trying to make them understand and started preparing for a world where understanding wouldn't be necessary because results would speak for themselves. I stopped asking for their approval and started earning approval from professors who recognized what I was building toward. I stopped explaining my dreams and started living them. What I didn't know, couldn't have predicted during those long summer months of family dinners filled with careful silences and changed subjects, was that leaving for Harvard wouldn't just transform me, it would freeze me in their minds, exactly as I was at 18, uncertain, searching, still finding my direction. No matter what I achieved in the years that followed, no matter how far I traveled, or how much I accomplished, or what heights I reached in service to justice itself, I would always be Marcus's little sister who was going through a legal phase that would eventually end when I came to my senses and embraced something more appropriate. Harvard Law School changed me in ways I couldn't have imagined during those anxious months of waiting for acceptance letters and family conversations that felt like gentle interventions. The intellectual rigor, the constant challenge of minds sharper than any I'd encountered in Millfield, the professors who treated constitutional law like poetry that could reshape civilization. All of it fed something in me that had been starving for years. Professor Jonathan Blackstone's constitutional law seminar became my second home, a place where questions that had consumed me since high school finally found their proper context. When he assigned us to write appellate briefs on landmark civil rights cases, I discovered I had a gift for legal reasoning that went beyond academic excellence. I could see patterns in legal precedent that others missed, could construct arguments that built on centuries of jurisprudence while advancing toward new interpretations. "Miss Whitmore," Professor Blackstone said after class one October afternoon, his voice carrying the kind of authority I'd never heard from authority figures in Millfield, "your brief on Brown v. Board wasn't just excellent. It was the kind of legal reasoning I'd expect from a federal appeals court. Have you considered clerking for a federal judge after graduation?" Federal clerkships.
The words felt like doorways to a world I'd only read about in case studies and Supreme Court biographies. The opportunity to work directly with the judges who shaped American law, to see constitutional interpretation happening in real time for millions of Americans. But explaining federal clerkships to my family proved as implausible as explaining Harvard had been. During Christmas break of my second year, sitting around the same dining room table where Marcus regaled everyone with stories from the police academy, I tried to describe the opportunity Professor Blackstone had helped me secure. "So you'd be like a secretary," Mom said, her relief obvious, "for a judge. That sounds much more reasonable than what I was imagining, much more appropriate for a young woman." A secretary. The reduction of a federal clerkship, one of the most competitive and prestigious positions in American law, to secretarial work revealed everything about how my family processed information that didn't fit their preconceptions. They heard what they needed to hear to make my choices comprehensible within their worldview. Marcus, now graduated and working as a patrol officer with the Millfield Police Department, looked up from his pot roast with the satisfied expression of someone whose life had unfolded exactly as expected. "At least you're finally doing something practical. Working for a judge sounds like real work, not like all that theoretical stuff you were doing in law school." Real work. As if constitutional interpretation and appellate brief writing were abstract hobbies rather than the foundation of American democracy. But I'd learned by then that trying to educate them about the significance of federal clerkships would only create more confusion and more opportunities for them to worry about my choices. The clerkship with Judge Margaret Chen of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals opened my eyes to the real machinery of American justice. Judge Chen, the first Asian American woman appointed to the Second Circuit, became more than a mentor. She became a glimpse of what my career could become if I had the courage to pursue excellence without apology.
"Elena," she told me during one of our regular conferences, reviewing a brief I'd drafted on First Amendment religious liberty issues, "you have something that can't be taught. You understand how law lives in the real world, how constitutional principles translate into human consequences. That's not common, even among very talented attorneys." Working for Judge Chan meant researching cases that would affect millions of Americans, helping craft opinions that would guide lower courts for decades, seeing how individual legal disputes became part of the larger tapestry of American jurisprudence. Every day felt like graduate school in democracy itself, but it also meant longer silences during family phone calls, fewer details I could share about my work, more conversations that ended with my parents' polite confusion about what exactly I was doing with my expensive education. "How's the secretarial work going, sweetheart?" Mom would ask during our weekly calls, her voice bright with the determination to stay connected to a daughter whose life had become incomprehensible to her. "It's going well, Mom. Very educational. And you're learning useful skills, things that will help you when you're ready to settle down and find something more permanent?" Something more permanent. As if working for a federal appellate judge were a temporary detour on the way to a more suitable destination they hadn't quite identified yet, but trusted would reveal itself eventually. The distance grew during those 2 years, not from lack of love, but from lack of translation. I was learning to speak constitutional law fluently, while they remained fluent in local expectations and conventional success. We loved each other across a gap that seemed to widen with every conversation that required me to simplify my world into concepts they could process without anxiety. When I applied for Supreme Court clerkships during my second year with Judge Chen, I didn't tell my family. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew the explanation would require more energy than I had while managing one of the most demanding application processes in American law. Only 12 positions available each year. Competition from every top law school in the country. Background investigations that made FBI security clearances look casual. References from judges and professors whose recommendations could make or break entire careers.
The interview with Justice Ruth Caldwell was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in February in her chambers at the Supreme Court building that had intimidated me since childhood civics passes. Justice Caldwell, appointed by President Clinton and known for her meticulous legal reasoning and sharp questions during oral arguments, represented everything I'd been working towards since that first constitutional law seminar at Harvard. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, reviewing my application with the kind of attention that made every word feel consequential. "Your academic record is impressive. Your writing samples are exceptional, and Judge Chen's recommendation is glowing. But I'm curious about something else. Why do you want to clerk for the Supreme Court? Not the career benefits or the prestige, but why this work specifically?" The question cut through every prepared answer I'd rehearsed, demanding honesty about motivations I'd never been asked to articulate. "Because law isn't abstract to me, Justice Caldwell. Every case that comes before this court affects real people living real lives, and the decisions made here echo through generations of Americans who may never know how Supreme Court precedent shaped their opportunities, their freedoms, their futures. I want to be part of that process, not as an observer, but as someone helping to craft the legal reasoning that will guide American democracy." Justice Caldwell smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen since entering her chambers. "That's exactly the answer I was hoping to hear. Welcome to the Supreme Court, Ms. Whitmore." The clerkship with Justice Caldwell was like earning a PhD in American democracy. Every case that came before the court during my year there taught me how constitutional principles translated into practical governance, how legal precedent shaped everything from voting rights to economic policy to individual freedoms most Americans took for granted. But it also meant even greater distance from my family's ability to understand what I was doing with my life. Supreme Court clerkships required security clearances, background investigations, confidentiality agreements that made casual conversation about work impossible. "How's Washington treating you, Elena?" Dad would ask during our monthly calls, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he used for topics he didn't quite grasp. "It's challenging and rewarding. I'm learning a tremendous amount." "Still working for that judge?" "Yes, Dad, still working for Justice Caldwell." "Well, I suppose it's good experience. Maybe it will help you when you're ready to come home and practice real law." Real law. As if the Supreme Court of the United States dealt in theoretical abstractions rather than the constitutional principles that governed every aspect of American life. The pattern was set. No matter what I achieved, no matter how far my career advanced or how significant my work became, I would always be Elena who was having interesting experiences in Washington before eventually returning to Millfield to practice the kind of law they could understand and approve of. What they couldn't see, couldn't comprehend through their filter of conventional expectations, was that I wasn't building a career in law. I was becoming law itself, moving through a judicial system where each position prepared me for greater responsibility, higher stakes, more complex decisions that would affect American democracy for decades to come. And what I couldn't tell them, couldn't explain without violating the confidentiality that protected the integrity of the judicial process, was that I was being groomed for something beyond their wildest understanding of what their daughter might become. Something that would require me to disappear from their conventional world almost entirely. To become someone's work demanded secrecy, not because it was shameful, but because it was so important that public scrutiny could compromise the independence of American justice itself.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus Whitmore had always prided himself on being observant. It came with the territory of police work, noticing details that others missed, recognizing patterns that revealed uncomfortable truths, asking the hard questions that made people squirm when they had something to hide. These skills had served him well during his 8 years with the Millfield Police Department, earning him commendations for solving burglary cases and domestic disputes that had stumped other officers. But it was those same investigative instincts that began eating away at him every time his sister Elena came home for family visits. Something about her story didn't add up, hadn't added up for years, and Marcus was tired of being the only one in the family who seemed to notice the inconsistencies. The first red flag had appeared 3 years earlier, during Elena's brief visit home for their grandfather's funeral. Marcus remembered standing in the funeral home parking lot, watching Elena step out of a black sedan with government plates, dressed in a tailored black suit that probably cost more than his monthly salary. When he'd asked about the car, she'd mentioned something vague about a government car service for federal employees traveling to family emergencies. Must be nice working for the government, he'd said, trying to keep his tone casual while his cop instincts started cataloging details that felt wrong. It has its benefits, Elena had replied, but something in her tone had shut down further conversation. She'd spent the entire viewing period fielding phone calls in hushed tones, stepping outside whenever her phone buzzed with what seemed like urgent messages. Marcus had watched her through the funeral home windows, noting how she held herself differently when she thought no one was looking. Gone was the uncertain younger sister who'd left for Harvard 15 years ago. In her place stood someone who carried herself with an authority that seemed inconsistent with being a secretary or clerk or whatever she claimed to be doing in Washington. The second red flag came during Christmas dinner 2 years ago. Elena had excused herself to take what she described as a work call during dessert, disappearing into Dad's study for nearly an hour. Marcus had walked past the door, ostensibly heading to the bathroom, and caught fragments of conversation that sounded nothing like administrative or clerical work. The circuit split on Fourth Amendment digital privacy issues requires immediate attention, he'd heard Elena say, her voice carrying the kind of authority usually reserved for supervisors giving instructions to subordinates. The CERT petition should emphasize the national security implications while maintaining focus on individual privacy rights. Circuit splits, CERT petitions, legal terminology that went beyond what any secretary or clerk would need to know, let alone discuss with the kind of expertise Elena had demonstrated during that phone call. Marcus had stood in the hallway, his police-trained mind automatically filing away inconsistencies that painted a picture he couldn't quite put together. When Elena had returned to the dinner table, she'd smoothly deflected questions about the call with practiced vagueness. Just some urgent filing deadlines, she'd said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You know how the federal government operates during the holidays. But Marcus did know something about how the federal government operated, at least from a law enforcement perspective. He'd worked with federal agencies on joint task forces, had coordinated with FBI field offices and U.S. attorney offices during multi-jurisdictional cases. He'd never encountered any federal clerics or secretaries who spoke with Elena's level of sophisticated understanding about constitutional law and federal procedure. The financial inconsistencies had been bothering him for years. Elena claimed to work as a law clerk, a position that Marcus had researched and discovered typically paid between $50,000 and $80,000 annually. Yet she owned a condominium in Georgetown that real estate websites valued at over $800,000. She drove a late-model Lexus, wore designer clothing, and seemed to travel internationally on what she described as educational opportunities that came up several times a year. During last year's barbecue, Marcus had finally decided to probe more directly. Elena, he'd said, settling beside her on Mom's patio while she scrolled through what looked like legal documents on her tablet, I've been wondering about something. How does a law clerk afford to live in Georgetown? I mean, I looked it up and those apartments aren't exactly government salary friendly. Elena had looked up from her tablet, her expression shifting into what Marcus recognized as a carefully controlled neutral mask, the kind of expression suspects wore when they were deciding how much truth to reveal. I do some consulting work on the side, legal research for private firms, document review, that sort of thing. It supplements the government salary. What kind of firms? Local DC practices or bigger national companies? Various firms. It depends on their needs and my availability. The answer was smooth, practiced, and completely unsatisfactory. Marcus had spent enough time interviewing suspects to recognize evasion disguised as cooperation.
Elena was giving him answers that sounded plausible on the surface, but revealed nothing substantial about her actual activities. That conversation had triggered what Marcus privately thought of as his Elena investigation, not because he wanted to expose her or cause problems, but because the inconsistencies in her story were driving him crazy with the same intensity that unsolved cases created pressure in his professional life. He'd started with public record searches, using the same databases he accessed for routine police work. Property records confirmed Elena's Georgetown condominium ownership, purchased 5 years ago with a cash down payment of $200,000. Tax records showed annual income that seemed consistent with her claimed government employment, but the financial picture still didn't explain how she'd accumulated enough savings for such a substantial real estate investment.
Vehicle registration records showed the Lexus was registered to Elena personally, not leased through any government fleet program. Credit reports, which Marcus probably shouldn't have accessed, but justified as family concern, showed excellent credit but very little detailed transaction history, as if Elena paid for most purchases in cash or through accounts that weren't reflected in standard consumer reporting. The deeper Marcus dug, the more questions arose instead of answers. Elena's social media presence was minimal to the point of being suspicious. Her LinkedIn profile listed her current position as law clerk, federal judiciary, with no additional details about specific courts, judges, or areas of specialization. For someone who'd graduated from Harvard Law School and clerked at prestigious federal courts, her professional online presence seemed almost deliberately obscured. Marcus had tried searching for Elena's name in legal databases that were sometimes accessible through law enforcement channels. Academic articles, published opinions, news coverage of significant cases, anything that might explain how a law clerk had achieved the kind of financial success and professional recognition that Elena clearly enjoyed. What he'd found had only deepened his confusion. Elena's name appeared as co-author on several law review articles dealing with constitutional interpretation and federal court procedure, but these weren't the kind of practical, nuts-and-bolts articles that clerks typically wrote. These were sophisticated analyses of Supreme Court jurisprudence and federal appellate strategy that read like they'd been written by someone with decades of high-level judicial experience. The most puzzling discovery had been a Supreme Court bar admission record showing Elena had been sworn into practice before the highest court in the country 3 years earlier. Supreme Court bar admission was typically a ceremonial honor for experienced attorneys and legal scholars, not something routinely pursued by law clerks unless they were planning to argue cases before the court, which law clerks definitely did not do. Marcus had printed out Elena's Supreme Court bar admission certificate from the online records database, staring at the formal language that certified Elena Catherine Whitmore as qualified to practice law before the Supreme Court of the United States. The certificate was signed by the Chief Justice himself, a detail that seemed inconsistent with Elena's claimed position as a mid-level federal employee. His investigation had accelerated after last month's family cookout, when Elena had received what she described as an urgent work call that required her immediate return to Washington. Marcus had watched her pack with the efficiency of someone accustomed to sudden travel, noticed how she'd secured her laptop and documents in what looked like a specialized briefcase designed for transporting sensitive materials. "Family emergency at work?" Marcus had asked, helping her load luggage into the Lexus. "Something like that," Elena had replied, but her phone had buzzed with a text message that she'd glanced at quickly before sliding the phone into her jacket pocket. Marcus had caught just enough of the message preview to see words like urgent consultation and national security implications, language that seemed far above the pay grade of any law clerk he'd ever encountered. That night, Marcus had called his contact at the FBI field office in Hartford, Agent Jennifer Walsh, whom he'd worked on several multi-jurisdictional cases over the years. "Jen, I need to ask you something confidential," Marcus had said, choosing his words carefully. "If someone claimed to work as a law clerk for federal courts, what would that job actually involve? Day-to-day responsibilities, typical career progression, that sort of thing."
Agent Walsh had been happy to explain the federal court system from a law enforcement perspective. Law clerks were typically recent law school graduates who worked for 1 or 2 years conducting research and writing draft opinions for federal judges. The work was intellectually demanding, but essentially academic, involving legal research and memo writing rather than policy development or case strategy. They're basically very smart research assistants, Walsh had concluded. Important work, but not the kind of position that would require security clearances or involve classified information. Why do you ask? Marcus had deflected the question with vague references to a career counseling conversation, but Walsh's description had only reinforced his growing certainty that Elena's claimed job didn't match her actual activities, lifestyle, or the level of responsibility she seemed to carry. The breaking point had come 2 weeks ago, during what should have been a routine family dinner at their parents' house. Elena had been unusually tense throughout the meal, checking her phone frequently and excusing herself twice to take calls that she described as administrative emergencies. During the second call, Marcus had followed her outside, ostensibly to help Dad with the grill, but actually to position himself where he could overhear Elena's conversation. What he'd heard had convinced him that his sister was either involved in something far more significant than she'd ever admitted, or she was running some kind of elaborate deception that had fooled their entire family. The constitutional implications of the warrantless surveillance program require immediate judicial review, Elena had been saying, her voice carrying the kind of authority that Marcus associated with federal prosecutors and high-ranking Justice Department officials. The circuit courts are split on digital privacy rights, and without Supreme Court guidance, we're looking at a constitutional crisis within the next 2 years. Constitutional crises, Supreme Court guidance, warrantless surveillance programs. This wasn't the language of clerical work or even high-level legal research. This was the language of someone involved in shaping national security policy at the highest levels of government. Marcus had returned to the dinner table that night with the uncomfortable certainty that Elena had been lying to their family for years about who she was and what she did for a living. But lying about what? Exactly. And why?
The possibilities that occurred to him ranged from the unlikely to the impossible. Maybe Elena worked for the CIA or NSA in some kind of legal advisory capacity that required cover stories about mundane government employment. Maybe she'd gotten involved with a private consulting firm that handled classified government contracts. Maybe she was working for a high-profile Washington law firm and was embarrassed to admit she'd abandoned public service for corporate money. Or maybe, and this was the possibility that kept Marcus awake at night, Elena was running some kind of long-term con game on their family, using her Harvard law degree and Washington connections to create an elaborate fiction about government service while actually working in private practice or consulting for clients she couldn't discuss publicly. The more Marcus thought about it, the more the deception scenario made sense. Elena had always been the smart one, the one who could talk her way out of trouble and convince adults that she was more mature and responsible than she actually was. Building an elaborate professional fiction wouldn't be beyond her capabilities, especially if it served some larger purpose that Marcus couldn't identify. What finally pushed Marcus from suspicion to action was discovering Elena's name in a legal database search that he'd conducted while researching a federal court case for the Millfield Police Department. The case involved a local drug trafficking investigation that had federal implications, and Marcus had been trying to understand how federal court procedures might affect local prosecution. While searching for information about federal court jurisdiction, Marcus had entered Elena's name into the legal database as a test of his research methodology. What came back had been a single result that made his blood run cold. Elena Catherine Whitmore listed as counsel of record on a Supreme Court amicus brief filed just 6 months earlier. Counsel of record on a Supreme Court brief. Not research assistant, not consulting attorney, not supporting staff. Counsel of record meant Elena had been authorized to represent the interests of whomever had filed that brief before the highest court in the country.
It meant she had the kind of professional standing and legal expertise that was completely inconsistent with everything she'd told their family about her career. Marcus had printed out the brief, a complex 40-page legal argument dealing with Fourth Amendment digital privacy rights that read like it had been written by someone with decades of constitutional law experience. Elena's name appeared on the signature page alongside attorneys from prestigious Washington law firms and constitutional law professors from top universities. That document had been the final piece of evidence Marcus needed to convince himself that Elena had been systematically deceiving their family about her professional life. The question was no longer whether she was lying, but what she was hiding and why. As a police officer trained to investigate deception and uncover hidden truths, Marcus felt a professional obligation to expose whatever elaborate fiction Elena had constructed around her supposed government service. But as her brother, he felt a personal betrayal that cut deeper than any professional misconduct he had ever investigated. Elena had let their parents worry about her unconventional career choices while knowing she was actually successful beyond their wildest imagination. She'd allowed Marcus to feel superior about his straightforward police career while hiding achievements that dwarfed anything he had ever accomplished. She'd sat through years of family dinners, accepting their gentle concern about her financial stability and professional prospects, while secretly earning recognition at the highest levels of American law. The deception felt like a personal insult to Marcus's intelligence and a fundamental betrayal of family trust. Worse, it made him wonder what other aspects of Elena's life might be fabricated, what other lies she might be telling to maintain whatever image she was trying to project. Marcus had spent the last 2 weeks building what he privately called his Elena file, a collection of public record searches, database results, financial documents, and timeline discrepancies that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning more than a decade. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming, and Marcus was confident that any reasonable person reviewing the material would conclude that Elena Catherine Whitmore had been running a long-term con game on her own family. The upcoming Thanksgiving dinner at Grandmother Rose's house would be the perfect opportunity to confront Elena with the evidence and demand explanations for inconsistencies that could no longer be ignored or explained away with vague references to government confidentiality requirements. He wasn't looking forward to the confrontation, but his police training had taught him that some situations required direct action regardless of personal comfort. Elena had made her choice when she decided to deceive their family for over a decade. Now, Marcus would make his choice to expose the truth, whatever the consequences might be for their relationship or family dynamics. The evidence file was ready, the questions were prepared, the stage was set for Thanksgiving dinner to become the day when Elena's elaborate deception finally collapsed under the weight of facts that could no longer be hidden or explained away with vague references to government confidentiality requirements. Marcus didn't know, couldn't have known, that the truth about Elena's career was more extraordinary than any deception he could have imagined, and that his confrontation would reveal not his sister's fraudulent claims, but his own fundamental misunderstanding of what she had actually achieved in service to American justice.
The invitation arrived on cream-colored stationery that had been Grandmother Rose's signature for 60 years, hand-delivered to each family member by her longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who'd been making these rounds for special occasions since Marcus and Elena were children. "Dearest family," the elegant script began, "this year has reminded me that time is precious and family is everything. I would be honored if you would join me for Thanksgiving dinner at Willowbrook Manor. Please come hungry for both food and stories. I have much to be grateful for, and I hope you do too. With all my love, Rose Whitmore." Marcus had received his invitation on a Tuesday evening, reading it while still in his patrol uniform after a particularly frustrating shift dealing with a domestic disturbance that had ended with arrests and paperwork that kept him at the station until nearly 10 p.m. The contrast between Grandmother Rose's elegant formality and the harsh realities of his police work struck him as symbolic of the distance that had grown between his everyday life and the world Elena claimed to inhabit.
Whitmore Manor, as Rose had called her sprawling Victorian mansion for as long as anyone could remember, had been the family's gathering place for major holidays since Marcus's childhood. The house itself was a monument to old Connecticut money, purchased by Rose's husband in 1952 when his shipping business was at its peak, maintained with the meticulous care that came from having both the resources and the determination to preserve family legacy. Rose Whitmore, now 84 and still formidable despite her age, had always been the family's emotional center. Widowed for 15 years but fiercely independent, she commanded respect from 3 generations of Whitmores through a combination of unconditional love and uncompromising expectations. Rose remembered birthdays, graduation dates, and relationship milestones with the precision of a master archivist, and her approval or disappointment could shape family dynamics for months. For Marcus, Rose's invitation represented the perfect opportunity to present his evidence about Elena's deception in a setting where the entire family could witness the confrontation and its aftermath. He'd been planning this moment for weeks, carefully organizing his documentation and preparing his presentation with the same methodical approach he brought to building criminal cases. The guest list for Rose's Thanksgiving would include 22 family members spanning 4 generations. Marcus's parents, Henry and Patricia, would be there, along with his uncle David and Aunt Susan, cousins from both sides of the family, and various in-laws and family friends who'd become honorary Whitmores over the years. Most importantly, Elena would be there, trapped in a social situation where she couldn't easily escape difficult questions or deflect scrutiny with her usual vague answers about government confidentiality. Marcus spent the week before Thanksgiving refining his approach, reviewing his evidence file, and anticipating Elena's likely responses to his accusations. He'd learned from 8 years of police work that successful confrontations required preparation, timing, and the ability to present facts in ways that made denial impossible. Elena was smart, Harvard Law School smart, but Marcus was confident that his systematic investigation had uncovered inconsistencies that even she couldn't explain away. The evidence file had grown to over 40 pages of documentation, financial records showing Elena's property ownership and vehicle registration, professional database searches revealing her Supreme Court bar admission and legal publications, timeline analyses demonstrating the impossibility of funding her lifestyle on a law clerk's salary, and transcripts of overheard phone conversations that revealed knowledge far beyond what any clerical employee would possess. Marcus had also prepared what he privately called his presentation strategy. Rather than launching into accusations immediately, he planned to ask seemingly innocent questions about Elena's work, gradually introducing pieces of evidence that would expose the contradictions in her story. The key was to let the facts speak for themselves while giving Elena enough rope to hang herself with increasingly implausible explanations. The plan was to wait after dinner, when the family would be relaxed and gathered in Rose's living room for coffee and dessert. Marcus would suggest a toast to family achievements, and then use that opportunity to acknowledge Elena's mysterious success and ask for details about her career progression. When Elena inevitably provided vague non-answers, Marcus would begin introducing his evidence in a way that would make her deception obvious to everyone present. The timing would be crucial. Marcus wanted the confrontation to happen when Elena couldn't easily leave, when she would be surrounded by family members whose opinions mattered to her, and when the social pressure to provide honest answers would be at its maximum. Thanksgiving dinner at Grandmother Rose's house, with its traditions of gratitude and family sharing, would create the perfect context for demanding truth about Elena's professional accomplishments. Marcus had even considered the possibility that Elena might become defensive or angry when confronted with evidence of her deception. His police experience had taught him that guilty parties often responded to exposure with anger, deflection, and attempts to shift blame to their accusers. He was prepared for Elena to claim that his investigation violated her privacy, that his evidence was somehow misleading, or that he was motivated by jealousy rather than genuine concern for family honesty. But Marcus was confident that the documentation he'd assembled would speak for itself. Public records don't lie. Database searches don't fabricate information.
Financial documents don't create fictional narratives. Whatever elaborate story Elena had constructed about her government service would collapse when confronted with objective evidence of her actual activities and financial situation. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, Marcus received a phone call from his mother that added an unexpected element to his planning. "Marcus, honey," Patricia said, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when discussing family dynamics, "I wanted to give you a heads up about tomorrow. Elena called this morning, and she sounded different, more stressed than usual. She mentioned something about work being particularly demanding lately, and she might need to take some phone calls during dinner."
Phone calls during Thanksgiving dinner. Marcus filed this information away as additional evidence of Elena's deception. What kind of law clerk received urgent calls during national holidays? What kind of clerical work was so important that it couldn't wait until the following Monday? Did she say anything specific about what kind of work emergency might require her attention during family dinner? Marcus asked, keeping his tone casual despite his growing excitement about catching Elena in another inconsistency. "Nothing specific, just that she's working on some kind of important project with tight deadlines. You know how Elena is. She never gives details about her government job. But she asks specifically whether Rose's house has good cell phone reception and a quiet room where she could take private calls if necessary." Private calls requiring good cell phone reception and quiet rooms. Marcus added this to his mental list of evidence that Elena's work involved responsibilities far beyond what any law clerk would handle. Government clerks didn't manage projects with critical deadlines that couldn't be interrupted for family holidays. "I'm sure whatever Elena's working on can wait for one family dinner," Marcus said, already looking forward to challenging Elena to explain exactly what kind of clerical emergency would justify disrupting Grandmother Rose's Thanksgiving celebration. Thursday morning dawned cold and clear, with the kind of November weather that made Connecticut look like a postcard advertising New England charm. Marcus dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a navy blazer over khakis. Formal enough to show respect for Rose's dinner traditions, but professional enough to lend authority to the confrontation he was planning. The evidence file was secured in a leather portfolio that Marcus placed in his car's trunk, easily accessible but not visible to family members who might wonder why he'd brought work materials to Thanksgiving dinner. He'd also prepared a condensed version of his key findings on index cards that he could reference discreetly during the conversation, ensuring that he could present his evidence systematically without relying on memory or losing track of important details. Marcus arrived at Whitmore Manor at exactly 2 p.m., the time specified in Rose's invitation. The house looked magnificent in the afternoon sunlight, its Victorian architecture and perfectly maintained grounds creating the kind of timeless elegance that made every family gathering feel like a special occasion. Rose had decorated the front porch with tasteful autumn arrangements, and warm light glowed from every window, creating an atmosphere of comfort and celebration. Inside, the house buzzed with the familiar energy of family gatherings. Uncle David was helping Rose's housekeeper arrange chairs in the dining room, while Aunt Susan supervised the children's table setup in the adjacent breakfast nook. The smell of roasting turkey and traditional side dishes filled the air, creating the sensory backdrop that had defined Whitmore family Thanksgivings for as long as Marcus could remember. Marcus spent the first hour making small talk with relatives, accepting compliments on his police work, and fielding the usual questions about when he might get married and start a family of his own. But his attention remained focused on the front door, waiting for Elena's arrival and mentally rehearsing the questions he would ask to begin exposing her deception. Elena arrived at 3:15 p.m., fashionably late, as always, but looking more polished and authoritative than Marcus remembered from previous family gatherings. She wore a charcoal gray wool dress that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly car payment, paired with jewelry that looked expensive and sophisticated. Her hair was professionally styled, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that Marcus associated with successful executives rather than government clerks. But what caught Marcus's attention immediately was Elena's phone behavior. Within minutes of arriving, she'd excused herself to take a call that she described as urgent consultation needed from Washington.
The call lasted nearly 20 minutes, during which Marcus positioned himself strategically to overhear fragments of conversation. What he heard confirmed his worst suspicions about Elena's elaborate deception. Through the partially closed door of Rose's study, Marcus caught phrases like constitutional interpretation, federal court jurisdiction, and national security implications. Elena's voice carried the kind of authority that suggested she was giving instructions rather than receiving them, making decisions rather than following orders. When Elena returned to the family gathering, she smoothly deflected questions about the call with her usual vague references to government deadline pressures and administrative complications. But Marcus noticed how she checked her phone frequently throughout the pre-dinner socializing, and how she seemed distracted despite her efforts to participate in family conversations. The formal dinner seating at Rose's mahogany table placed Elena directly across from Marcus, a position that would be perfect for the confrontation he was planning. Marcus spent the meal making casual conversation while mentally reviewing his evidence and waiting for the optimal moment to begin his questioning. Rose, as always, presided over the dinner with graceful authority, guiding conversation topics and ensuring that every family member felt included in the celebration. She asked Elena about her work with the kind of polite interest that didn't probe too deeply, accepting Elena's vague references to challenging federal court projects without demanding specifics. But Marcus noticed how her answers had become more elaborate over the years, more detailed in their vagueness. She spoke about complex constitutional issues and inter-circuit jurisdictional challenges with the fluency of someone who understood the terminology well enough to use it convincingly. The sophistication of her legal vocabulary had grown substantially since her early career, suggesting either advanced education that she had never mentioned or extensive experience with high-level legal concepts that no law clerk would typically encounter. As dinner progressed, Marcus felt his confidence growing about the confrontation he was planning. Elena's behavior throughout the meal, the important phone calls, the expensive clothing, the sophisticated legal terminology, and the obvious financial comfort all reinforced his conclusion that she'd been systematically deceiving our family about her professional accomplishments and current position.
The stage was set perfectly. The entire family was present to witness Elena's exposure. The evidence was overwhelming and well documented. The timing would be ideal once they moved to the living room for coffee and dessert. Marcus had no idea that the confrontation he was planning would reveal not Elena's deception, but his own fundamental misunderstanding of what his sister had actually achieved. He couldn't have known that the evidence he'd gathered, which seemed to prove Elena's fraudulent claims, actually documented the career of someone whose accomplishments were so extraordinary that even he couldn't have imagined them. The trap was set, but Marcus had no idea who would be caught in it when the truth finally emerged. As Rose began clearing the dinner plates and preparing to serve dessert in the living room, Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that preceded major arrests. This was his moment to expose the truth, to force Elena to account for years of deception, and to give their family the honesty they deserved. What happened next would change everything, not just for Elena, but for every person in that room who thought they understood what success looked like and what family loyalty meant. The transition from dinner to coffee in Rose's living room happened with the choreographed precision that marked all Whitmore family gatherings. 22 family members moved through the Victorian mansion's connected rooms, like actors who'd rehearsed their positions for decades, carrying crystal coffee cups and delicate china dessert plates, while settling into the arrangement of antique furniture that had hosted these conversations for generations. Marcus positioned himself strategically near the marble fireplace, where Rose's collection of family photographs created the perfect backdrop for what he intended to be a defining moment in Whitmore family history. From this vantage point, he could see every family member, control the flow of conversation, and ensure that Elena would be the center of attention when he began presenting his evidence. Elena sat in the burgundy velvet armchair that had been Rose's late husband's favorite reading spot,
looking relaxed despite the frequent buzzing of her phone with what she continued to describe as urgent administrative matters. She held her coffee cup with the kind of unconscious elegance that Marcus recognized as practiced social grace, the result of years attending events where presentation mattered as much as presence. "Before we get too comfortable," Marcus announced, standing near the fireplace with the authority he'd learned from addressing crowds during community policing events, "I'd like to propose a toast to family achievements. We have a lot to be proud of around this table." Rose looked up from her coffee with the pleased expression she always wore when family members acknowledged shared accomplishments. "What a lovely idea, Marcus. Please, go ahead." Marcus raised his coffee cup, noting how Elena's attention had shifted from her phone to his face with the kind of focused alertness that suggested she sensed something significant was about to happen. "To Aunt Susan's promotion to department head at Hartford General," Marcus began, acknowledging his aunt's recent career advancement with genuine warmth. "To Cousin Jennifer's acceptance to veterinary school. To Uncle David's successful completion of his real estate certification program." Each acknowledgement received appreciative murmurs and brief applause from the assembled family members. Marcus was building momentum, establishing himself as the gracious family member who recognized everyone's contributions before focusing attention on the elephant in the room. "And especially," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the particular tone he used when transitioning from pleasantries to serious police business, "to Elena's mysterious and apparently very successful career in Washington. I think it's time we all learned more about what our accomplished sister and daughter has really been doing for the past 15 years. The shift in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Elena's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, her coffee cup settling onto its saucer with the sound that seemed louder than it should have in the suddenly quiet room. Around the living room, family members leaned forward with the kind of interest that suggested they'd been wondering about Elena's career for years, but had been too polite to ask directly. "Oh, you don't need to put me on the spot," Elena said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "My work isn't really interesting dinner conversation. Government legal work tends to be pretty dry and technical." "But that's just it," Marcus replied, setting down his coffee and pulling out the first index card from his jacket pocket. "I've been doing some research, and your work seems far from dry. In fact, it seems quite extraordinary for someone who describes herself as a law clerk." Patricia shifted uncomfortably on the sofa beside Rose, recognizing the tone Marcus used when he was building towards something significant. "Marcus, honey, maybe this isn't the time." "Actually, Mom, I think this is exactly the time. Elena has been modest about her achievements for too long. I think the family deserves to understand just how successful she has become." Elena's phone buzzed against the side table where she'd placed it, the sound cutting through the tension like an alarm. She glanced at the screen, then looked back at Marcus with an expression that had shifted from casual wariness to something approaching concern. "Marcus, what exactly are you trying to say?" Elena asked, maintaining her calm tone despite the obvious strain of being the center of unwanted attention. "I'm saying that law clerks don't typically own $800,000 condominiums in Georgetown. I'm saying that government clerks earning $60,000 a year don't drive brand new Lexus sedans or wear designer clothing that costs more than most people's monthly salaries."
The property record passed from hand to hand around the living room, family members examining the official documentation with growing confusion and interest. Uncle David whistled softly at the property value, while Aunt Susan frowned at the purchase date that showed Elena had bought the condominium during what she'd claimed was the financially tight early years of her government service. "Elena," Rose said quietly, her voice carrying the particular authority that came from 8 decades of managing family dynamics, "perhaps you could help us understand these discrepancies." "There are no discrepancies," Elena replied, but her composure was beginning to crack around the edges. I've done well for myself through hard work and smart financial decisions. I don't see why that requires detailed explanation or justification to my family. Hard work doing what, exactly? Marcus pressed, pulling out his second index card. Because I've done extensive research into federal court employment, and I can't find any law clerk positions that would provide the kind of income or professional recognition that you clearly enjoy. He reached into his jacket and produced the printed Supreme Court bar admission certificate, holding it up like evidence in a criminal trial. For instance, I discovered that you're admitted to practice before the Supreme Court of the United States. That's not typically something that government clerks pursue unless they're planning to argue cases before the highest court in the country. The Supreme Court bar admission certificate created an even stronger reaction than the property records. Henry leaned forward to examine the document more closely, his accounting background allowing him to appreciate the significance of credentials he'd never heard Elena mention. Supreme Court admission? Patricia said, her voice rising with a mixture of pride and confusion. Elena, why didn't you ever tell us about this? This sounds like a tremendous honor. It's mostly ceremonial, Elena said, but her response sounded rehearsed and defensive. Many attorneys pursue Supreme Court admission for professional development reasons. It doesn't necessarily indicate any special expertise or responsibilities. Marcus smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose trap was working exactly as planned. Mostly ceremonial. That's interesting, because I also discovered that you've been listed as counsel of record on multiple Supreme Court amicus briefs over the past 3 years. The third piece of evidence, printed pages from the Supreme Court brief database, created near silence in the living room. Even the younger family members who didn't fully understand the legal terminology could sense that Marcus was revealing information that fundamentally challenged everything they thought they knew about Elena. Counsel of record on Supreme Court briefs? Rose repeated slowly, her sharp mind processing the implications even without complete legal knowledge. Elena, dear, that sounds like something a very senior attorney would do, not someone in a clerical position. Elena's phone buzzed again, more insistently this time, and she glanced at it with an expression that suggested the call might be legitimately urgent. But Marcus was just getting started with his presentation, and he had no intention of allowing her to escape the conversation with another mysterious work emergency. There's more, Marcus continued, enjoying the way Elena's usual confidence was eroding under the weight of documented evidence. Financial analysis shows that Elena has been living substantially beyond any realistic government salary for over 5 years. Property ownership, vehicle purchases, travel expenses, clothing allowances, the numbers don't add up unless she's earning significantly more than any law clerk position would provide. He pulled out bank records, information he probably shouldn't have accessed, but justified as necessary family investigation, showing deposits that were clearly inconsistent with federal government pay scales. Furthermore, Marcus said, warming to his presentation, I've overheard multiple phone conversations where Elena discusses constitutional law, federal court jurisdiction, and national security matters with the kind of expertise and authority that would be impossible for someone in a subordinate clerical position. The bank records passed through the room like smoking gun evidence, creating whispered conversations between family members who were beginning to understand that Elena had been living a double life for years. Elena, Henry said, his voice carrying the disappointment of someone whose trust had been systematically violated, what Marcus is showing us suggests that you've been deliberately misleading this family about your career and your circumstances. Can you explain why you would do such a thing? Elena stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking under the sustained pressure of Marcus's evidence presentation and the family's growing suspicion. I haven't misled anyone about anything, she said, her voice rising for the first time during the confrontation. I've told you that I work for the federal government in a legal capacity. I've told you that my work is sensitive and that I can't discuss details. Those statements are completely accurate. But accurate but deceptive, Marcus shot back, pulling out his final piece of evidence.
Because what you haven't told us is that you're apparently running some kind of elaborate consulting business using your government credentials, or you're working for a private law firm while claiming to be in public service, or you're involved in something that requires this level of financial secrecy and professional misrepresentation. The final document was a timeline Marcus had created showing the progression of Elena's financial success alongside her claims about government employment, with annotations highlighting the impossibility of reconciling her lifestyle with her stated career. This timeline shows 15 years of systematic deception, Marcus announced to the room, his voice carrying the authority of someone presenting evidence to a jury. 15 years of letting this family worry about your financial stability while you were secretly earning more than any of us. 15 years of allowing us to make excuses for your mysterious career while you were building some kind of professional empire that you couldn't be honest about.
The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Elena stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by family members who were looking at her with expressions ranging from confusion to disappointment to anger. The evidence of her deception was spread across Rose's antique coffee table, like exhibits in a criminal trial.
"Elena,"
Rose said, her voice carrying 8 decades of authority and disappointment,
"I think you owe this family an explanation. We have loved you and supported you and worried about you for years. If Marcus is right about this financial analysis, then you've been allowing us to worry unnecessarily while building a successful career that you chose to hide from the people who care about you most."
Elena looked around the room at faces she'd known since childhood, at people who'd celebrated her high school graduation and worried about her unconventional choices and supported her through the uncertainties of early adulthood. Now those same faces reflected the hurt and confusion that came from discovering that someone they'd trusted had been systematically dishonest about fundamental aspects of her life.
"You want an explanation?"
Elena said, her voice trembling with emotions that Marcus couldn't quite identify.
"You want to know what I really do for a living? You want to understand why I can't talk about my work in detail?"
Her phone buzzed again, but this time Elena answered it immediately, her voice taking on a tone of authority that silenced the entire room. "This is Justice Whitmore," she said into the phone, her words carrying across the living room like a revelation that rewrote everything everyone thought they knew about reality. "I understand the urgency, but I'm currently with family. Can this wait until tomorrow morning unless it's a genuine constitutional crisis?" Justice Whitmore. The words echoed through the room like a thunderclap, creating the kind of stunned silence that follows news too significant to process immediately. Elena listened to the voice on the other end of the call for several seconds, her expression growing more serious as she absorbed whatever information was being conveyed. "No, that can't wait. Patch me through to the Chief Justice immediately. And get me a secure line. This conversation requires encryption." She ended the call and looked around the living room at 22 family members whose faces reflected the dawning realization that Marcus's investigation had uncovered not Elena's deception, but evidence of accomplishments so extraordinary that none of them had been capable of imagining them. "You want to know what I really do for a living?" Elena repeated, her voice now carrying the kind of authority that Marcus had only heard from federal judges and senior government officials. "I'm an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. I've held that position for 3 years after serving as a federal appellate judge for 4 years before that." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Marcus felt his evidence file slipping from his hands as he processed the impossibility of what Elena had just revealed. Supreme Court Justice. Not law clerk, not consultant, not even senior attorney. One of the 9 most powerful people in the American legal system. His sister! The woman he just accused of running an elaborate con game on their family was actually someone whose decisions shaped American law and constitutional interpretation for hundreds of millions of people. Elena's phone rang again, and this time Elena carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the entire country. "This is Justice Whitmore. Put me through to the Attorney General immediately." As Elena stepped out of the living room to take what was clearly a genuinely urgent call about national security matters, Marcus stared at the scattered evidence of his investigation, documents that he thought proved his sister's deception, but that actually documented the career of one of the most accomplished legal minds in American history. The confrontation he'd planned to expose Elena's fraud had instead revealed the magnitude of his own ignorance about what she'd actually achieved in service to American justice. And in approximately 5 minutes, when Elena's security detail arrived to check on her welfare, after what their monitoring systems had identified as a potential threat situation, Marcus would discover that arresting a Supreme Court justice for fraud was about to become the most catastrophic mistake of his law enforcement career. The first sign that Elena's phone call wasn't just another work interruption came when the windows in Rose's living room began reflecting red and blue lights from the street outside. Marcus, still reeling from Elena's revolution about being a Supreme Court justice, initially assumed the emergency vehicles were responding to some unrelated incident in the neighborhood. Millfield was a quiet town where police cars and ambulances were unusual enough to draw attention, but not entirely unprecedented. But the lights weren't passing by. They were stopping directly in front of Whitmore Manor. "Elena," Rose called toward the study where Elena had taken her urgent call with what she described as the Attorney General. Through the partially open door, family members could hear fragments of conversation that used terminology none of them fully understood, but that clearly involved national security implications far beyond local law enforcement. "Understood, Mr. Attorney General. The constitutional implications of surveillance overreach require immediate judicial review. I'll have my chambers prepare preliminary findings for emergency conference tomorrow morning." Marcus moved to the front window, pushing aside Rose's lace curtains to get a clear view of what was happening outside. What he saw made his blood run cold with the dawning realization that his confrontation with Elena had triggered consequences he couldn't have imagined.
3 black SUVs with government plates had formed a protective perimeter around the manor's circular driveway. 2 unmarked sedans blocked the street at both ends, creating a security zone that looked like something from a presidential motorcade. Federal agents in dark suits were taking positions around the property, speaking into earpieces and conducting what appeared to be a threat assessment of the Victorian mansion that had never hosted anything more dangerous than spirited debates about holiday dinner preparations. "Marcus," Patricia said, her voice rising with anxiety as she joined him at the window. "What is happening? Why are there federal agents surrounding grandmother's house?" Before Marcus could formulate an answer that made sense of what he was witnessing, the front door opened with an authority that bypassed Rose's usual requirement for visitors to knock and wait for proper invitation. 6 figures entered the foyer with the coordinated precision of people accustomed to securing high-value targets in potentially hostile environments. The man leading them was tall, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal gray suit that managed to look both professional and intimidating. His bearing suggested military background, but the badge hanging from his belt identified him as someone from the federal law enforcement community. Behind him came 5 other agents whose combined presence transformed Rose's elegant entry hall into something resembling a command center. "United States Marshal Service," the lead agent announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made civilian police departments step aside without question. "We're responding to a potential threat against a protected federal official. I need everyone to remain calm and identify themselves clearly." Protected federal official, the words hit Marcus like a physical blow as he began to understand that Elena's revelation about being a Supreme Court justice wasn't some elaborate escalation of her deception, but the truth that explained why federal agents were now securing his grandmother's house like it was a potential crime scene. I'm Chief Deputy Marshal William Chen, the lead agent continued, his eyes scanning the living room where 22 family members sat frozen in various states of confusion and growing alarm. We received an alert that Justice Whitmore might be experiencing a security situation. I need to speak with her immediately. Justice Whitmore? The title echoed through the living room like confirmation of something too extraordinary to believe. Elena wasn't just claiming to be a Supreme Court justice, she actually was one, and her security was considered important enough to warrant an immediate federal response to what the Marshals Service had apparently interpreted as a potential family threat. Rose, despite her age and the shock of having federal agents in her living room, managed to maintain the gracious authority that had defined her approach to unexpected social situations for 8 decades. Justice Whitmore is in the study, taking an important call, she said, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used for decades when managing family crises. Perhaps you could wait a moment while she finishes her conversation with the Attorney General. Chief Deputy Chen's expression shifted from professional alertness to something approaching surprise. The Attorney General. Elena wasn't just a Supreme Court justice. She was currently managing some kind of constitutional crisis that required direct coordination with the highest levels of the Justice Department, while surrounded by federal agents who'd responded to protect her from what they'd perceived as a family threat. Elena emerged from the study, still holding her phone, but having clearly ended her call with whoever she'd been discussing constitutional crisis management. Her demeanor had shifted completely from the defensive posture she'd maintained during Marcus's confrontation to the kind of calm authority that suggested she was accustomed to managing complex situations involving multiple federal agencies. Deputy Chen, she said, recognizing the lead agent with the familiarity of someone who worked regularly with federal law enforcement at the highest levels. I appreciate the rapid response, but this is a family situation, not a security threat. My brother was asking questions about my career, and I had to take an urgent call about the surveillance case we're hearing next week. The surveillance case we're hearing next week. Elena spoke about Supreme Court cases like they were routine business matters, because for her, they were. She wasn't claiming to work on constitutional issues. She was actually deciding them at the highest level of American government in cases that would affect millions of people for generations. Justice Whitmore, Deputy Chen replied, his tone carrying the kind of respect that Marcus had never heard directed toward any member of his family. Our monitoring protocols indicated elevated stress levels and potential confrontational dynamics. We're required to respond to any situation that might compromise your security or interfere with your judicial responsibilities. Monitoring protocols, elevated stress levels. Elena's life was apparently subject to the kind of federal protection usually reserved for presidents and foreign dignitaries, because her work was critical enough to American democracy that threats against her were considered threats against the constitutional system itself. Marcus stared at his sister, the woman he'd spent weeks investigating for fraud, the family member he'd accused of running elaborate deceptions, the person he'd been planning to expose as a liar in front of their entire extended family. Elena Catherine Whitmore, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, one of 9 people whose decisions shaped American law and constitutional interpretation for over 300 million citizens.
His little sister. There's been a misunderstanding, Elena continued, looking directly at Marcus with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that might have been pity. My brother has been conducting what he believed was an investigation into financial irregularities and professional misrepresentation. He had concerns about my lifestyle and career claims that seemed inconsistent with what I'd told the family about my government work. Deputy Chen's expression shifted as he processed the implications of Elena's explanation. Family member conducting investigation into Supreme Court justice's finances and professional background. Security breach involving detailed surveillance of protected federal official.
potential compromise of classified information about judicial activities and personal security arrangements. Mr. Whitmore, Deputy Chen said, turning toward Marcus with the kind of professional attention that suggested he was now considered a person of interest in a federal investigation, I need to understand the scope and methods of this investigation you conducted. What information did you gather? How did you obtain it? And who else has had access to your findings? Marcus felt his mouth go dry as he realized that his weeks of careful police work building a case against Elena had actually constituted unauthorized surveillance of a Supreme Court justice. Every database search, every financial record review, every overheard phone conversation had been a potential violation of federal laws protecting judicial security and independence. I used standard police databases, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he began to understand the magnitude of his situation. Public record searches, property ownership verification, professional credential confirmation. I thought I was investigating potential fraud or identity misrepresentation. Standard police databases, Deputy Chen repeated, making notes in a small leather portfolio that suggested Marcus's activities were now part of an official federal investigation. And you shared this information with other family members. Around the living room, 22 relatives who'd been enjoying what they'd thought was a family dinner began to realize they'd been exposed to classified information about a Supreme Court justice's personal life, financial arrangements, and security details. Information that was apparently protected at levels they'd never imagined, shared during what federal agents were treating as a potential security breach. Elena stepped forward, her judicial robes traded for family dinner attire, but her authority unmistakable to everyone in the room. Deputy Chen, I want to be clear that my brother's investigation was motivated by genuine family concern, not malicious intent. He believed I was deceiving our family about my career and financial situation. His methods were inappropriate, but his motivations were understandable. The protection Elena was offering Marcus felt like another blow to his already shattered understanding of their relationship. Even after he'd humiliated her in front of their entire family, accused her of elaborate fraud, and triggered a federal security response, she was still defending him to federal agents who clearly viewed him as a potential threat to national security. Nevertheless, Deputy Chen continued, unauthorized surveillance of federal judicial officials is a serious matter, regardless of intent or relationship. The information gathered during this investigation will need to be secured, and all parties who had access to it will need to be debriefed about confidentiality requirements. Patricia made a small sound of distress from her position on Rose's sofa. Henry loosened his tie like he couldn't breathe properly. Uncle David stared at his hands while Aunt Susan whispered urgent questions to her teenage daughter about whether she'd posted anything on social media about Elena's career or financial situation. Furthermore, Deputy Chen said, his attention returning to Marcus, we'll need to conduct a full review of your law enforcement access privileges and database usage history. Misuse of police resources for personal investigations is a serious matter, particularly when it involves protected federal officials. Marcus felt his career dissolving around him as he processed the implications of Deputy Chen's words. Misuse of police resources, unauthorized surveillance of federal officials, potential security breach involving classified information about judicial activities and personal security arrangements. Elena, Rose said, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority that came from 8 decades of managing family crises. I think we need to understand something. Are you really an associate justice of the Supreme Court? Really and truly? Elena looked at her grandmother, the woman who'd raised her to value honesty, integrity, and service to something larger than personal ambition, and nodded with the kind of quiet dignity that Marcus recognized as genuine. Yes, Grandma. For 3 years now. Before that, I served 4 years as a federal appellate judge on the D.C. Circuit. Before that, I clerked for Justice Caldwell, then worked as a federal prosecutor specializing in constitutional law cases. Each revelation hit the room like evidence in a trial that was rewriting their understanding of everything they thought they knew about Elena's life. Federal appellate judge, Supreme Court clerk, federal prosecutor, a career trajectory that represented the highest levels of achievement in American law, accomplished by someone they'd thought was struggling to find her place in the world. "Why didn't you tell us?" Patricia asked, her voice breaking with the pain of discovering that her daughter had achieved something so extraordinary while allowing her family to worry about her unconventional career choices. Elena looked around the room at faces she'd known since childhood, at people who'd shaped her values and supported her dreams even when they couldn't understand them. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 15 years of secrets she'd kept to protect both her work and her family. Because Supreme Court justices don't have normal family relationships. Because everything about my life is subject to security protocols and public scrutiny. Because once you know who I really am, every conversation we have, every family gathering we attend, every interaction we share becomes part of the public record and potential national news. The explanation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, helping everyone understand why Elena had chosen professional anonymity over family recognition. She hadn't been deceiving them out of shame or pride. She'd been protecting them from the loss of privacy and normalcy that came with being related to one of the most powerful people in American government. And because, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as she looked directly at Marcus, I knew that some people would never be able to accept that their sister, their daughter, their granddaughter had achieved something this significant. I knew that some people would prefer to believe I was running an elaborate con game rather than accept that I might actually be more successful than they'd ever imagined possible. The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. He had preferred to believe Elena was a fraud, rather than accept that his little sister had achieved something beyond his understanding or ability to match. As federal agents continued securing the manor and debriefing family members about confidentiality requirements, Marcus stared at the scattered evidence of his investigation. Documents that he'd thought proved Elena's deception, but that actually documented the career of one of the most accomplished legal minds in American history. His sister. The woman he'd handcuffed for impersonating a federal official was actually one of the 9 most powerful people in the American legal system. And in approximately 10 minutes, when his supervisor at the Millfield Police Department received a call from the U.S. Marshal Service about an officer who'd been conducting unauthorized surveillance of a Supreme Court justice, Marcus would discover that some mistakes are too catastrophic to survive. The secure conference call that interrupted what was supposed to be Elena's family Thanksgiving came through on a phone that Marcus had never seen before. A device that looked more sophisticated than standard government equipment, with encryption indicators and priority alert systems that suggested communications far above typical federal employee access levels. "This is Justice Whitmore," Elena answered, her voice immediately shifting into the authoritative tone that had shocked her family just minutes earlier. "I understand we have a developing constitutional crisis regarding the NSA surveillance program ruling. What's the current status?" Chief Deputy Marshal Chen gestured for the family to remain seated while Elena took what was clearly a Supreme Court conference call in Rose's Victorian living room. The surreal contrast between the antique furniture and crystal chandelier overhead and the urgent discussion of constitutional law and national security created an atmosphere unlike anything the Whitmore family had ever experienced. "Chief Justice Roberts is convening an emergency session," Elena continued, her legal expertise evident in how quickly she absorbed complex information and formulated responses. "Yes, the circuit split on digital privacy rights requires immediate resolution. The national security implications can't wait for regular session scheduling."
Marcus watched his sister manage what appeared to be a genuine constitutional crisis with the same calm efficiency she'd once used to organize their childhood games. But this wasn't pretend authority or imagined importance. Elena was participating in decision-making processes that would affect the constitutional rights of every American citizen. "Tell the Attorney General I'll have my preliminary opinion ready for emergency review by tomorrow morning," Elena said, "and inform the Solicitor General that oral arguments may need to be expedited if we're going to prevent a complete breakdown of federal surveillance protocols." Attorney General, Solicitor General, emergency Supreme Court sessions? Elena was discussing these high-level government operations with the casual familiarity of someone for whom constitutional crisis management was routine professional responsibility. When Elena ended the call, she looked around the living room at 22 family members whose faces reflected the dawning understanding that they'd spent 15 years fundamentally misunderstanding who she was and what she'd accomplished. "I'm sorry for the interruption," Elena said, her tone shifting back toward family interaction, but retaining the underlying authority that came from making decisions that shaped American democracy. "But when the constitutional framework of American surveillance law is in jeopardy, Supreme Court justices don't get to take holidays." Supreme Court justices don't get to take holidays. The casual way Elena referenced the impossibility of normal work-life balance helped explain years of mysterious absences, urgent phone calls, and professional commitments that seemed inconsistent with any government job her family could understand. Rose, despite the shock of learning her granddaughter's true position, managed to maintain the gracious curiosity that had defined her approach to family relationships for 80 decades. "Elena, dear," she said, her voice carrying genuine interest rather than the polite confusion that had marked previous conversations about Elena's career. "When you say you're deciding constitutional issues, what does that actually mean? What kinds of decisions do you make?" Elena settled back into the burgundy armchair that had been her grandfather's favorite reading spot, looking suddenly younger as she prepared to bridge the gap between Supreme Court jurisprudence and family dinner conversation. "Well, for example, the call I just took was about a case we're hearing next week involving whether the government can collect digital communications without warrants. My decision, along with 8 other justices, will determine the privacy rights of every American who uses email, text messaging, or social media." The explanation created stunned silence as family members processed the scope of Elena's actual responsibilities. Privacy rights for every American, constitutional interpretation affecting hundreds of millions of people, decisions that will influence American law for generations. "Or last month," Elena continued, warming to the opportunity to finally discuss her work with people she'd known since childhood, "we decided a case about voting rights that will affect how elections are conducted in 37 states. The month before that, we ruled on healthcare access issues that will determine medical privacy protections for the next decade."
Each example revealed another layer of Elena's professional reality that was completely disconnected from anything her family had imagined possible. Voting rights, healthcare access, constitutional protections that shaped daily life for millions of Americans, decided by someone they'd thought was struggling to find meaningful work in Washington? Deputy Chen, still positioned near the living room entrance as part of Elena's security detail, pulled out his phone and began what appeared to be a verification process that would confirm Elena's identity and current judicial status to family members who were still struggling to accept the reality of her position. "Justice Whitmore's current Supreme Court bio is publicly available," he said, accessing official government databases on his secure device. Appointed 3 years ago by President Biden after serving 4 years on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Harvard Law School, magna cum laude, Supreme Court clerkship for Justice Ruth Caldwell, federal prosecutor for 7 years specializing in constitutional law cases. Each credential hit the room like evidence in a trial that was systematically demolishing everything they'd believed about Elena's career trajectory. Harvard magna cum laude, not just law school graduation, but academic excellence at the highest level. Supreme Court clerkship, one of the most competitive positions in American law.
Federal prosecutor? Not clerical work, but trial experience prosecuting complex cases. Author of 12 major Supreme Court opinions over the past 3 years, Deputy Chen continued, reading from Elena's official judicial record. Specialist in Fourth Amendment privacy rights, First Amendment religious liberty cases, and federal jurisdiction issues, considered one of the leading constitutional scholars of her generation. 12 major Supreme Court opinions. Constitutional scholar, leading expert in multiple areas of federal law. Elena hadn't just achieved professional success, she'd become one of the most influential legal minds in American history, shaping constitutional interpretation that would guide federal courts for decades. Marcus felt his understanding of their sibling relationship collapsing as he processed the scope of what Elena had accomplished while he'd been building what he'd thought was a fraud case against her. Every piece of evidence he'd gathered, the financial success, the legal expertise, the professional recognition, had actually documented Elena's extraordinary achievements rather than proving her deception. Elena, Henry said, his accounting background helping him appreciate the significance of credentials he'd never fully understood. When you said you worked as a law clerk, were you deliberately trying to mislead us about your actual position? Elena looked at her father with the patience of someone who'd spent years navigating the gap between judicial reality and civilian understanding. Dad, when I started as a Supreme Court clerk 15 years ago, that's exactly what I was, a law clerk. When I became a federal prosecutor, I told you I worked for the Justice Department in legal research, which was accurate. When I was appointed to the federal appellate court, I said I'd been promoted to a judgeship. But you assumed it was a local position. The chronology revealed how Elena had been telling the truth throughout her career progression, but in ways that allowed her family to interpret her achievements through their limited understanding of government service. She'd never lied. She'd simply allowed them to construct explanations that made sense within their worldview. And when I was appointed to the Supreme Court, I told you I'd received a significant promotion that would require even more confidentiality about my work. You assumed it was an administrative advancement. I let you believe that because the alternative was explaining that your daughter had become one of the 9 most powerful people in American government. One of the 9 most powerful people in American government. Elena wasn't exaggerating or using hyperbole. As a Supreme Court justice, she held lifetime tenure in a position that wielded authority over constitutional interpretation affecting every aspect of American life. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with Rose's linen napkin, processing the emotional weight of discovering that her daughter had achieved something beyond her wildest dreams while allowing her family to worry about her unconventional career choices. Elena, sweetheart, why didn't you trust us enough to tell us the truth? We would have been so proud. We are so proud. Elena's expression softened as she looked at her mother, the woman who'd worried about her daughter's financial stability while Elena was earning a Supreme Court justice's salary, who'd made excuses for Elena's mysterious work while Elena was deciding constitutional law cases. Mom, Supreme Court justices don't have normal family relationships. Everything about our lives becomes public record. Every family gathering, every conversation, every personal relationship gets scrutinized by the media, analyzed by political commentators, and used by interest groups to influence judicial decisions. The explanation helped everyone understand why Elena had chosen professional anonymity over family recognition. She hadn't been protecting her own privacy, she was protecting theirs. More importantly, Elena continued, her voice taking on the authority she'd learned from managing constitutional crises, I knew that some people would never be able to accept that I'd achieved something this significant. I knew that questions about my qualifications, my worthiness, my right to hold such an important position would create family tension that might never heal. She looked directly at Marcus as she spoke, acknowledging without cruelty that his investigation had proven her concerns about family acceptance were justified. And, Elena added, her voice taking on the authority she'd learned from managing constitutional crises, I needed to protect the integrity of my judicial work. If my family knew my true position,
every conversation we had, every opinion you expressed about legal issues, every political view you shared could potentially create conflicts of interest or appearance of impropriety in cases before the court. Conflicts of interest, appearance of impropriety. Elena had been protecting not just her family's privacy, but the independence of the judicial system itself, ensuring that personal relationships couldn't compromise her ability to make impartial constitutional decisions.
Deputy Chen's radio crackled with updates from other federal agents who were apparently conducting security sweeps of the manor's grounds and coordinating with local law enforcement about the situation involving Marcus's unauthorized investigation. Justice Whitmore, Deputy Chen said, his tone carrying the respect reserved for someone whose security was considered critical to national interests. We're going to need to conduct formal debriefings with all family members who were exposed to information about your personal life, financial arrangements, and security details. This is standard protocol for protecting judicial independence and preventing future security breaches. Formal debriefings. Security breaches. Elena's family dinner had become a federal incident requiring the same protocols used to protect state secrets and national security information. Additionally, Deputy Chen continued, Officer Whitmore's database access and investigative activities will need to be reviewed by federal authorities. Unauthorized surveillance of Supreme Court justices is a serious federal crime, regardless of familial relationship or stated intentions. Marcus felt his law enforcement career ending in real time as he processed the implications of Deputy Chen's words. Federal crime. Unauthorized surveillance. His weeks of careful police work had actually constituted criminal activity against one of the most protected officials in American government. Elena stood up, her judicial authority evident even in casual family dinner attire, and addressed her family with the kind of calm command that Marcus recognized from federal courtrooms and high-level government briefings. I want everyone to understand something, she said, her voice carrying across Rose's living room with unmistakable authority. What happened here today, Marcus's investigation, the family's exposure to classified information about my work, the federal response to what appeared to be a security threat, all of this could have been avoided if we'd been able to have honest conversations about my career 15 years ago. The implicit criticism was gentle but clear. Elena's secrecy had been necessary, but it had also created the conditions that led to Marcus's investigation and the family's fundamental misunderstanding of her accomplishments. But, Elena continued, looking around the room at faces she'd known since childhood, I also want you to understand that the woman you're looking at, the Supreme Court Justice, the constitutional scholar, the federal appellate judge, she's the same person who used to help Marcus with his homework and organize family talent shows and worry about disappointing Grandma Rose with unconventional life choices. The statement bridged the gap between Elena, the family member, and Justice Whitmore, the constitutional authority, helping everyone understand that her extraordinary professional achievements hadn't changed the fundamental person they'd known and loved for 32 years. The difference, Elena concluded, is that now you know what I've been doing with my life instead of wondering why I couldn't find suitable work or worrying about my financial stability or making excuses for my mysterious career to your friends. As federal agents continued their security protocols and family members processed the magnitude of Elena's revelations, Marcus stared at the scattered evidence of his investigation, documents that had seemed to prove his sister's deception, but that actually chronicled one of the most remarkable career achievements in American legal history. His little sister, the woman he'd accused of fraud, one of the 9 most powerful people in the American constitutional system. The truth was more extraordinary than any deception he could have imagined, and more devastating to his understanding of their relationship than any lie she could have told. The federal investigation into Marcus's unauthorized surveillance activities concluded 6 weeks after Thanksgiving dinner at Whitmore Manor, delivered in a manila envelope that arrived at his apartment on a gray December morning when Connecticut snow was beginning to accumulate on windowsills and bare tree branches. Marcus had been suspended from the Millfield Police Department since the Monday following the family dinner, pending the outcome of what his chief had described as the most serious breach of professional conduct in department history. The investigation had been thorough, methodical, and devastating in its findings about his misuse of law enforcement resources to conduct personal surveillance on a Supreme Court justice. The final report, stamped with Department of Justice letterhead and signed by Assistant Attorney General Rebecca Martinez, laid out the scope of Marcus's violations in clinical detail that made his actions look like a sustained attack on judicial independence, rather than family concern gone wrong. Officer Marcus Whitmore conducted unauthorized database searches, accessed confidential financial records, hired civilian contractors to surveil a federal judicial official, and gathered classified information about Supreme Court security protocols over a period of 18 months, the report stated in language that would become part of his permanent federal law enforcement record. While Officer Whitmore's stated motivation was family concern rather than malicious intent, the scope and duration of his surveillance activities constitute serious violations of federal laws protecting judicial independence and national security. The consequences were as comprehensive as they were career-ending. Marcus's law enforcement certification was permanently revoked, his police pension was forfeited, his access to federal databases was terminated with prejudice, meaning he could never work in law enforcement, private security, or any field requiring background investigations. But the personal consequences were more devastating than the professional ones. The Marcus who opened that federal report was a different man than the one who'd confidently presented his evidence to the family 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks of living with the knowledge that his investigation had not just been wrong, but criminally wrong, had hollowed him out in ways that went beyond career destruction. Elena had tried to call him twice in the weeks following Thanksgiving dinner. Both times, Marcus had let the calls go to voicemail, unable to face conversations with the sister he'd humiliated in front of their entire family. The sister whose extraordinary achievements he'd been too small to recognize, too jealous to accept, too proud to celebrate. The voicemails remained unheard on his phone like evidence of grace he didn't deserve.
Marcus, Elena's voice said in the first message, left 3 days after federal agents had finished their security debrief at the manor. I know the situation is difficult for everyone, but I want you to know that I don't blame you for the investigation. You were trying to protect our family from what you thought was deception. I understand that motivation, even if I can't approve of your methods. The second voicemail had come 2 weeks later, after news of Marcus's suspension had spread through Millfield's small law enforcement community like wildfire. Marcus, I heard about your situation with the police department. I want you to know that I didn't request any specific action against you. The federal investigation was standard protocol for security breaches involving judicial officials. If you want to talk about what happens next, I'm available. You're still my brother. You're still my brother? Elena's capacity for forgiveness felt like another indictment of Marcus's character. Another reminder that the woman he'd tried to destroy was actually more generous than he'd ever been capable of being. The knock on Marcus's apartment door came on a Wednesday evening in mid-January, nearly 2 months after the disaster at Rose's house. Marcus opened it to find Elena standing in his hallway, wearing a simple wool coat over what looked like business attire, holding a thermal coffee cup, and looking like someone who'd driven directly from Supreme Court chambers to a Connecticut apartment complex that probably violated several security protocols. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she'd used throughout their childhood when one of them needed to apologize for hurting the other's feelings. "Can we talk?" Marcus stepped aside wordlessly, gesturing Elena into the sparse apartment that had become his world since losing everything he'd thought defined him. The contrast between Elena's obvious success and his own diminished circumstances felt like visual confirmation of how completely their roles had reversed. Elena settled onto Marcus's discount furniture, with the same unconscious grace she'd shown in Rose's Victorian living room. But now Marcus understood that grace came from years of navigating high-stakes social situations where Supreme Court justices had to project authority while remaining approachable. "How are you holding up?" Elena asked, and Marcus could hear genuine concern in her voice despite everything he'd put her through. "How do you think I'm holding up?" Marcus replied, his voice carrying bitterness that surprised them both. I lost my career, my pension, my reputation, and my ability to work in law enforcement anywhere in the country, all because I was too stupid to realize my sister was more successful than I could imagine. Elena absorbed his anger without defensiveness, the way she'd probably learned to handle hostile questioning during Supreme Court oral arguments. You lost those things because you chose to conduct unauthorized surveillance instead of having an honest conversation with me, she said gently, and because you preferred to believe I was a fraud rather than accept that I might have achieved something extraordinary. The accuracy of her assessment stung worse than any punishment federal authorities could have imposed. Marcus had chosen suspicion over trust, investigation over communication, public humiliation over private discussion. But, Elena continued, her voice taking on the tone she'd used when they were children and she was trying to solve problems that seemed insurmountable, what happens next is still your choice. How you rebuild from this is still in your control. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Rebuild what? I'm a disgraced former cop with no pension, no prospects, and a federal record that makes me unemployable in any field that requires security clearance? What exactly am I supposed to rebuild from? Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder that looked official enough to make Marcus's stomach tighten with anxiety about more federal consequences he hadn't anticipated. You're supposed to rebuild from this, she said, handing him the folder. A recommendation letter for the Federal Public Defender's Office in Hartford. They need investigators with law enforcement background to work on cases involving police misconduct and civil rights violations. Marcus opened the folder to find a letter of recommendation written on Supreme Court letterhead, signed by Justice Elena Whitmore, describing his investigative skills, his commitment to uncovering truth, and his potential value to an organization that defended constitutional rights against government overreach. You recommended me for a job? Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper as he processed the impossibility of Elena's generosity. After everything I did to you, you're trying to help me find work? I'm recommending you for work that matches your skills and your apparent passion for investigating government officials who abuse their authority, Elena replied with the faintest hint of humor. The irony seemed appropriate. The job recommendation was more than Marcus deserved, more than he dared to hope for, and more evidence of Elena's character than he could comfortably accept. Elena, he said, setting the folder on his coffee table like it might explode if handled incorrectly. Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me after what I tried to do to you? Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking out Marcus's apartment window at the Connecticut winter landscape that stretched toward their childhood neighborhood and the family that was still processing the revelation of who she'd become. Because 15 years ago, when I left for Harvard Law School, I made a choice to pursue excellence at the cost of family closeness. I chose professional achievement over personal relationships, judicial independence over family intimacy. Those were necessary choices for the career I wanted, but they had consequences I didn't fully anticipate. She turned back toward Marcus, and he could see something in her expression that looked like regret mixed with hard-won wisdom.
One of those consequences was creating distance that allowed my own brother to believe I was capable of elaborate deception rather than extraordinary success. Another consequence was missing 15 years of opportunities to be proud of each other's achievements instead of suspicious of each other's motivations. The confession felt like an apology for choices she'd made in service to constitutional justice, choices that had shaped American law, but had also shaped their family dynamics in ways that led inevitably to Thanksgiving dinner confrontations and federal investigations. I can't undo the choices I made about how to manage my career and family relationships, Elena continued, but I can choose how to handle the aftermath of your investigation. And I choose to remember that the brother who investigated me for fraud is the same brother who taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with math homework and worried about me when I made unconventional life choices. The grace Elena was offering felt overwhelming to Marcus, who'd spent 2 months living with the knowledge that his investigation had been motivated by jealousy, resentment, and an inability to accept his sister's success. I don't deserve this, Marcus said, gesturing toward the job recommendation and Elena's willingness to forgive what couldn't be undone. Probably not, Elena agreed with the same direct honesty she'd always used with him. But deserve isn't the point.
Family is the point, and figuring out how to be family when one of us is a Supreme Court justice and the other is a disgraced former police officer, that's our new challenge. Elena stood up, preparing to leave his apartment and return to whatever constitutional crises were waiting for her attention in Washington. But she paused at the door, looking back at Marcus with an expression that reminded him of childhood moments when they'd had to forgive each other for bigger hurts than they'd known how to handle. "Marcus," she said, "I want you to understand something. The investigation you conducted, the evidence you gathered, the questions you asked, they all led to the wrong conclusion because you couldn't imagine that I'd achieve something this significant. But your investigative skills, your attention to detail, your commitment to uncovering truth, those abilities are exactly what organizations like the Public Defender's Office need." She opened the door, then looked back one final time. "The difference between investigating me for fraud and investigating actual government misconduct isn't your skills. It's choosing to use those skills in service of justice instead of jealousy. The Federal Public Defender's Office gives you a chance to make that choice." After Elena left, Marcus sat in his apartment holding a Supreme Court justice's recommendation for employment with an organization that defended constitutional rights against government abuse. The irony was perfect and devastating. His sister was offering him a chance to rebuild his career by investigating the kind of misconduct he'd committed against her. 3 months later, Marcus started work as an investigator for the Federal Public Defender's Office in Hartford, Connecticut. His first case involved investigating police surveillance overreach in a civil rights lawsuit, work that required exactly the database skills and investigative techniques he'd misused during his unauthorized surveillance of Elena. The work was challenging, meaningful, and restorative in ways that Marcus hadn't expected. Every case he investigated, every abuse of authority he documented, every constitutional violation he helped expose became a form of penance for his own misuse of law enforcement resources. More importantly, the work gave him a framework for understanding Elena's career choices and judicial philosophy. Through defending constitutional rights against government overreach, Marcus began to appreciate the importance of judicial independence, the necessity of protecting privacy rights, and the courage required to make decisions that prioritize constitutional principles over popular opinion. Elena and Marcus began rebuilding the relationship slowly, carefully, through monthly dinners at neutral restaurants where Supreme Court security protocols could be maintained and family conversations could happen without federal oversight. They talked about cases they couldn't name, constitutional principles they both served, and the different ways they'd chosen to protect the rights that democracy required. The family dinners at Rose's house resumed eventually, but with new understanding of why Elena's work required confidentiality and respect for the sacrifices that public service demanded. The woman they'd known as their mysterious daughter and granddaughter was now acknowledged as Justice Whitmore, whose decisions shaped American law in ways that affected every person around Rose's mahogany dinner table. Marcus never fully forgave himself for the investigation that had nearly destroyed his relationship with Elena and had ended his law enforcement career. But he learned to channel his investigative skills toward constitutional justice, working cases that protected the rights Elena defended at the Supreme Court level. Years later, when Marcus had established himself as one of the most effective civil rights investigators in Connecticut, Elena would tell him that his unauthorized surveillance of her had taught her something important about the gap between judicial authority and family relationships. "You investigated me because you couldn't imagine that someone you'd known since childhood could achieve something extraordinary. That investigation taught me that hiding my achievements didn't protect our family. It created the conditions for misunderstanding and resentment that damaged relationships more than honesty would have." The lesson Elena learned from Marcus's investigation influenced her approach to subsequent family relationships, leading her to be more open about her judicial work within the constraints of security protocols and constitutional requirements.
But the most important lesson came from understanding that family relationships required the same commitment to truth and justice that constitutional interpretation demands. Sometimes protecting the people you love means trusting them with difficult truths instead of comfortable illusions. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from learning to forgive the people who love you enough to hold you accountable, even when their methods reveal more about their own limitations than your supposed failures.
The Whitmore family learned that success looks different for everyone, that achievement doesn't always fit conventional expectations, and that the most extraordinary accomplishments sometimes require the most ordinary virtues: patience, understanding, and the courage to believe that the people you love are capable of greatness you can't yet imagine. Justice Elena Whitmore continued serving on the Supreme Court, shaping American constitutional law with decisions that balanced individual rights against collective security, always remembering that the law exists to protect real people living real lives, including families struggling to understand each other across the gaps that success sometimes creates. And Marcus Whitmore continued investigating government misconduct, using skills he'd learned as a police officer to protect the constitutional rights that his sister defended at the highest level of American justice. Their story became a testament to the truth that family love survives even the most catastrophic misunderstandings, and that sometimes the people who challenge us most are the ones who love us enough to believe we can become better than we've ever imagined possible.